A huge new ruling on voter ID from the North Carolina Court of Appeals is now focusing all eyes on North Carolina's Supreme Court and on the 3 court seats that are up for grabs this election. Becky Gray is here to explain why. She is the Senior Vice President at the John Locke Foundation, has been following all of these court cases and the election really closely. Becky, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Donna.
All right, let's set the stage here. Back in 2018, we had an election, and we North Carolina voters approved 2 amendments, one related to requiring a photo ID to vote, another one related to a cap on the tax rate in the state.
Right, and of course these are amendments to our state constitution.
Absolutely, right. So we approved those by vote. But then in 2019, a trial court came in and overturned the voters' vote. That brings us to just a couple weeks ago, Becky. We have a Court of Appeals ruling here in North Carolina that has made another change. Help us understand what this means.
Well, and it is kind of complicated because this court case overturned a rule of the people, a vote of the people, as you mentioned. And so, it's alarming for that reason. The other thing that is really concerning about this is this lawsuit was based on that this General Assembly was illegitimate and everything they did was illegitimate, specifically these 2 provisions for these constitutional amendments. So anything that they did doesn't matter. It should be wiped away.
I mean, that's what the trial court then ruled after North Carolina voted.
And the trial court agreed with the NAACP. Where this will go, and the question that remains is, was the General Assembly that the courts, again, said had gerrymandered the districts? Is that an illegitimate General Assembly? Well, if you buy into that argument, and this was part of the opinion of the Court of Appeals, if you buy into that argument, then everything that the General Assembly did was illegitimate. So are the teachers going to give back their pay raises? Are we going to take the money back that we spent for roads? Are we going to take back the money that we put into the education system? And this isn't the only district or General Assembly that served and made actions under districts that were declared gerrymandered. This goes back to decades. So, you open that Pandora's box, where does it end?
And in fact, the North Carolina Court of Appeals, in a 2-1 ruling, decided that argument made no sense.
Right.
So they have now reinstated the North Carolinians' votes on those 2 constitutional amendments. That was to approve voter ID and to approve this tax cap measure. So the important thing to know for our listeners, Becky, is what does this mean for this election in terms of voter ID?
Well, it is off the table because, Donna, again, nothing is easy, and this is way more complicated than we can talk about in the short amount of time that we have. But, in addition to this NAACP lawsuit, there are other lawsuits that are out there. There has been a stay, if you will, on the voter ID. So one thing that I think our listeners really need to know is this doesn't make any change for what we're currently going through with this November election. So no voter ID is required.
Okay.
Now, subsequent elections, we'll see how this shakes out. We may, in fact, be able to go back to what the people voted on to require a voter ID, but that's on down the road. For right now, so again, complicated, lots of different things going on at the same time while this court case is going on, whether to determine whether or not North Carolinians are going to have to provide a voter ID. Our election for November is going forward. No voter ID is required.
So for now, at least based on this North Carolina Court of Appeals ruling, they have reinstated essentially the people's vote from 2018, which was to approve these 2 constitutional amendments. But because of all the court wrangling, the 2020 election, no photo ID required because
Correct.
There's still court cases to be heard.
Correct.
Before we get to the issue of the North Carolina Supreme Court, the highest court in our state, and what role that body is going to play in this whole conversation, let's talk a little bit about this 2nd constitutional amendment that voters approved in 2018, then was struck down by a trial court in 2019, but now again, just a few days ago, the Court of Appeal says, no, we're going to reinstate this one too. What was it?
And that was a cap on how much you can pay out of your personal income for taxes. Now, the change was, this has been part of our Constitution for decades, that it was capped at 10%. You don't have to pay any more than 10% of your income in income taxes for North Carolina. This just brought that cap down to 7%, from 10% to 7%. So it ensures, it gives some integrity and ensures taxpayers that their personal income that they're getting, they will always be able to keep part of it. Again, voters voted overwhelmingly in favor of that cap. I think it's important, too, to understand, Donna, when we're talking about was the General Assembly properly seated in order to make these decisions? The General Assembly did not make a decision on the voter ID or the tax cap. What they did was, by a 3/5 vote of the General Assembly, they voted to put that in front of the voters. Now, how those members of the General Assembly voted when they went into the ballot box, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. The people of North Carolina voted to put those provisions in our Constitution. So that's one thing that gets really murky to me, looking at these court decisions and what the judges are looking at. You know, even if for some crazy reason they would agree that the whole General Assembly was illegitimate, the vote of the people, in my view, ought to take precedence over that.
We know that specifically in terms of the new Court of Appeals ruling on voter ID, again, reinstating the North Carolina vote from 2018, the NAACP has already said they're going to appeal this to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Tell us
First of all,
what that scenario is.
First of all, no surprise there at all. We certainly anticipated this. They have made it official. So it will go to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Currently, the North Carolina Supreme Court, of course, we have an election for 3 of those seats coming in November, but currently there are 6 Democrats on the North Carolina Supreme Court and 1 Republican. Now, our colleague Mitch Kokai has written extensively and brilliantly on a lot of the decisions that have come out and how those votes have fallen and how the justices have voted. I'd certainly refer anybody to that. But as it goes to the North Carolina Supreme Court, it's important for people to recognize these are the kind of decisions that the Supreme Court makes, and who sits on that court and the balance of the court is incredibly important for voter ID. Now, Donna, one of the things is, as we've seen in the past, these judicial races, sometimes it's hard to know a lot about the judges, and they're, at the bottom, they don't get a lot of money, so you're not going to see the television ads. You've done a fabulous job with moderating some panels of these judges to bring that to light so people have a better idea of who they're voting for. But with this, the voter ID, the tax cap, but in addition to this, opportunity scholarships are, on the chopping block. That's going to go before the North Carolina Supreme Court.
And that's an education voucher for low-income kids in North Carolina.
Yes. Redistricting issues, tax issues. I mean, it goes on and on. The different things that the North Carolina Supreme Court, public safety, law and order issues is also, the top of the list there. So what I'm hoping will come out of this, and it is confusing and there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of moving parts, but what I'm hoping is that voters will look at these Supreme Court candidates in the Supreme Court, our right to vote on these folks for the North Carolina Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and realize how critically important it is and the kind of things that affect our everyday life that is in their hands. And so who sits on that court is just incredibly important. So if you are a voter who cares about voter ID, if you care about limiting the amount of money that government can take out of your pocket, if you care about school choice and making opportunities available, particularly to low-income kids, if you care about those things, then you ought to care a lot about these judicial elections for the North Carolina Supreme Court and Court of Appeals that we have an opportunity to vote on.
And in fact, when it comes to those 3 seats on the North Carolina Supreme Court that you will vote on in this November's election, first of all, Becky, people may not even realize, at least some of our listeners, and they're astute people, they follow public policy, may not realize we actually elect Supreme Court members here in our state.
Yeah.
They may also not realize that they are partisan races, meaning on your ballot, you're going to be able to tell which candidate is a Democrat, which candidate is a Republican, and of course everyone makes their own assessments as to what that means to them. You want to find out more about philosophy, etc.
More information voters have, the better, in my view.